Hi there, welcome to Indycar on Wednesday the 24th of October. Today we're hearing more news from the European Union and particularly more news from the British government about its own projected, what should we say, warnings about what a no-deal Brexit could mean, with the Office for National Statistics and various other public bodies coming out with new warnings every day about the possible ramifications of a no-deal exit. The biggest one, of course, is this idea that there won't be border guards and border posts built, staffed, ready to go in time for the 29th of March next year. Now, I think it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that the British government was not going to be ready for these new border controls. But what they're saying is that if there's a no-deal exit, then there will be enormous queues because they won't have the staff, there won't be the infrastructure in place to deal with the very complicated process of checking loads and so on. The border force director today was saying that goods coming in from the EU after the 29th of March wouldn't see any great problems because, as he said, they would basically just be waved through because the standards of the European Union for things like food and products and so on are so high that they already meet and exceed all of the British standards, so there's no real reason to check these loads unless there's something unusual coming from outside of the EU. But the issue of what happens to British goods going out is the main problem, and that's where the issues lie. And the government and its agencies are continuing to trail their coats here. Basically, they're laying out the worst case scenario so that when the deal is done, whatever that exit deal is, that it seems a lot more palatable by comparison to, say, a no-deal exit where everything's chaotic. They've also been advising people that they may have to stockpile vital medicines that they need. So those people who rely on things like pain medication or particular medication for things like anti-rejection drugs, drugs to treat dementia or other conditions, they might need to stockpile those because there may be big delays in getting such drugs through customs after a no-deal, so-called no-deal exit. But all of the scaremongering that's being done is being done obviously to make whatever the British negotiators are trying to achieve seem like a good idea. And at the end of the day, when it comes back to the British Parliament to be voted upon in the so-called meaningful vote, now the meaningful vote is just actually a set of words. It doesn't actually make it meaningful. It just means that MPs in Westminster get to decide whether or not the deal that's been negotiated is to their liking or not. The government itself can actually force the legislation through whether they like it or not. So the meaning of the meaningful vote is largely moot as far as I can see. The government has the powers to push through whatever the deal is, as long as it's obviously a reasonable enough deal that it's not going to harm the UK too much. But as we know, no matter what deal is done, it will harm the whole of the UK, and it will always harm Scotland's exports much worse. It's going to do much more damage to Scotland than almost any other part of the United Kingdom. And the interesting thing about Scotland is that it is being treated as a part of England, because when you look around you, you'll see that Gibraltar now has a deal in place. Gibraltar voted to remain, and it's being given a deal which allows it to remain in the customs union and the single market with Europe. Ireland, they're talking about giving Northern Ireland a special deal to keep it in the union, to keep it in the customs union, sorry, and to keep it within the single market. Scotland, on the other hand, sod all, absolutely nothing. Scotland voted, of all of the areas of the UK, one of the highest levels of votes to remain. And yet we get dragged out, we get no special treatment whatsoever, despite being the biggest contributor to the UK's export trade balance. We are the largest, basically the largest fraction of it in terms of the amount of money that is earned by Scotland for the UK exchequer each year. And yet we get absolutely nothing out of the deal with the EU whatsoever. Now, moving on from that to yesterday's Clearpoll test. Now, I'd been pushing this for a long time, so I have to admit that I feel a bit foolish today, because although I was trying to explain to people this is a technology test and it's a phone app that we're testing and it's not a real poll, people have got hold of the idea that it's definitely some kind of meaningful poll. It wasn't. It was us testing the system out to see if this telephone poll would work. And now we know that it won't work properly in Scotland for a very ironic reason, and that is that unless you happen to be a Virgin Media customer, you would not be able to get access to that poll question, for the simple reason that all of the data servers for the mobile phone networks in Scotland, except one, all of the servers are in London or Manchester or somewhere in the south of England. Now, this is interesting because it means that the Clearpoll app, this is an Australian company, remember, who's trying to test this blockchain phone app in Scotland as a way to see if they could get us to use it for deciding our IndyRef question. But it didn't work, not because of the polling company, well, not exactly, certainly not because of the people in Scotland, but because of the fact that the mobile phone networks are all based in the south of England, and all of their infrastructure is in the south of England, except, interestingly, for Virgin Media, which has one server location in Edinburgh. And because of that, I was able to vote yesterday, but only because I took my phone home and connected it to my Virgin Media Wi-Fi so that I could actually see the poll through the data link, through the server in Edinburgh, and actually got to vote. I'm guessing that somewhere around about maybe three quarters of the people who wanted to vote yesterday couldn't do it because all of the server power is in England. We're actually suffering from the very same disadvantage that we're voting to get rid of, and it's actually stopping the Clearpoll app from working. The physical nature of the infrastructure in the UK is it's mostly in England. Even mobile phone networks in Scotland, the data streams are going to English server arrays down there. Nothing up here except for one company, Virgin Media, which has thoughtfully put a server system near Edinburgh, which means that at least people in central Scotland, if they connect to Virgin Media Wi-Fi, will get a chance to use Clearpoll. But it's interesting as a test because it means that for the government to design a new blockchain system, which they are working on, there's 2 universities involved with the Scottish Government in developing it, that a mobile phone system or access to the vote through mobile phones will mean that the Scottish Government will need to install dedicated servers in Scotland to make the system work. So one thing that yesterday did prove is that there was a big ironic flaw in the idea of using the phone app as a blockchain voting tool. And that flaw is just simple. It's the London-centric nature of the mobile phone companies. Because they're based in and around the southeast of England and all of their server arrays are down there, there's nothing up here that would identify your phone as being in Scotland unless you happen to be connected through Virgin Media, and then the system would recognise you as living in Scotland. And this was the problem yesterday. I was very frustrated and angry that I couldn't get onto this system after plugging it with people so much and talking it all up. I felt pretty stupid yesterday because all of a sudden nobody could get access to it. There was panic, people were cursing and swearing. I was annoyed. Dave Llewellyn was running about trying to find out what was going on, and we eventually figured out what was going on, and it was all to do with the fact that all the data servers are in England, except one. British media is controlled by England, basically, and even the data media, in other words, the data that I'm using at this very moment to talk to you, is going through a server down in London somewhere. It's not going through a server in Edinburgh, because I'm at the moment talking to you on a Vodafone link, which is going by 4G through their mobile phone system down to a data handling server down in London somewhere. And so to all intents and purposes, the internet is convinced that my phone is actually in London at the moment, because that's where my service provider is linking me to. So we have to get over this problem. If Scotland's to have a blockchain system in place for next year, we need dedicated servers around Scotland so that every part of Scotland can get a mobile phone signal and can get the data encrypted through those servers. Now, a server is just basically a big computer that handles all the data streaming into it from all the mobile devices, and it makes sure that that data goes to the correct places and that the app is shared across all of the different devices. So that server is not the thing that controls the blockchain app. The blockchain app is controlled by all the phones and computers connected to it. So don't get me wrong, this is not a central computer, but we do need to make sure that Scotland has its infrastructure in place. And at the moment we lack that. And it's just such a bitter irony that the one thing we really needed to make the blockchain work yesterday is denied to us by basically the London-centric nature of the mobile phone companies, who are all based in clusters in England. None of the infrastructure is here. But I would like to say to Virgin Media, if they're listening to this broadcast, if anybody who works for Virgin Media watches the show, you're in an excellent position to go and talk to the Scottish Government about becoming the major contractor to help set up the blockchain voting system. Because you've already got servers in Edinburgh right near to where the Parliament building is. So if you are a Virgin Media technology expert or in some way involved in the handling of Virgin Media data, really it's time to go and speak to the SNP government about this, because you're in the perfect position to exploit a major cock-up by the rest of the mobile phone networks who haven't bothered their backsides to put in any data handling equipment in Scotland. So we live in interesting times, and as I say, I feel sorry and foolish for punting this Clearpoll app. Now, the Clearpoll app, interestingly, was being administrated from Australia. So their technologists, when this problem arose yesterday, were actually all in their beds. It was the middle of the night in Australia, right? So we've got an Australian company that assumed that a country the size of Scotland would have mobile data handling servers of its own. But it doesn't, because we're not a country. We're not viewed as a country by the mobile phone companies, except, interestingly, Virgin Media. So I was quite glad yesterday that we have a Virgin Media contract at home, and I've got Wi-Fi at home and TV through Virgin Media, and they're not the perfect company, the most brilliant in the world, but they're reasonable, and at least they have equipment here. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, maybe it's time to get a Virgin Media account if you want to be taking part in blockchain votes. I don't know, but it's certainly food for thought, and it's shown exactly what we hoped it would show, is what would make it possible for blockchain to work in Scotland. Now we know what makes it possible and what makes it impossible, and it's a simple, basic thing. We need computer servers physically located in Scotland in order to make blockchain work. So it's a very, very basic thing that we need. I'm pretty sure that the guys at the universities who are working with the Scottish Government are already doing this. But it's interesting that other companies from outside of Scotland, like Clearpoll, assume that a country the size of Scotland would have this infrastructure, and they are shocked to find that we don't have it, because they'd assumed that that's what we would use with our mobile phone network to vote on their poll, and it didn't work. Interestingly, there were, when I last looked at the poll, somewhere around about 1,500 people had managed to vote yes on the poll, and only 5 had voted no, which means that it was mainly yes voters and activists who responded to all my pleadings to test this system out. It doesn't mean that we've got, a 98% yes vote. It just means that most of the people who tried the system out were the ones who watched this show and other blogs that were proposing that we test it out. But thank you all for your help, because what we did yesterday, although it wasn't successful, it was successful as an experiment, because it proved what the weakness was in the system. And now we know what that weakness is, that the government can now address that. If they haven't already, they can see now how vitally important it's going to be to have dedicated servers in Scotland for this system. And that we can't rely on mobile phone networks to do this work for us. that we have to have partners who can provide this equipment and can keep it safe and keep it secure. Anyway, I'll leave it there for today, but thank you for your patience yesterday, and I'm sorry it was such a disappointment that the Clearpoll app failed to live up to our expectations. But those of us who did manage to use it, it was quite easy. But one of the biggest complaints we all had, and I still have as well, is there are far too many personal polls cluttering up the system. So you come on there and you see dozens of Scottish independence polls set up by individuals, which completely muddy the waters. It's very hard to find the poll that you're looking for. The one we were looking for was supposed to be on featured polls, but unless you had Virgin Media connection, you couldn't see it. So what does it prove? Well, it just proves that whatever can go wrong will go wrong, but it also proves that it's always worth experimenting before you put a system in. Find the weak spots, eliminate the weak spots, and build a stronger system. Now we know it can be done, and now we know what we need to do to put it in place. So anyway, thank you everybody who took part yesterday for your patience. I'm sorry it was such a frustrating day. If you can manage to vote, you can still do it up to the end of the month. All you have to do is take your mobile phone to any place that has a Wi-Fi provided by Virgin Media and connect to that Wi-Fi, and you will be able to see the vote. The poll number, if you can manage it, is, if I remember right, it's 23016. 23016 is the poll number to look for if you manage to get a Virgin Media connection. And carry on testing the system out, see how you like it. But phone polls can work. The difficulty is they just can't work at the moment because the British state is set up so that all of the equipment is basically in England. And that's of course what we need to change. Everything needs to move from England to Scotland. That's the whole point of independence. That's what's wrong with Scotland. It doesn't get any of this stuff. That's why we're voting to change things. That's why we want independence, so that we are not left out in the boondocks like this while everything else happens in London. Okay, enough ranting. I'll see you all tomorrow. There'll be more news on Brexit and more news also on the Constitution, which I've got some new things to tell you about tomorrow. See you all later. Have a great day.